and speaking of, though, relative to your entrepreneurial success, there are a number of essential skills involved in being a successful entrepreneur. And using an entrepreneurial skill or a mindset in one's corporate work is also can be, sort of identified as entrepreneurial. What would really be important, I've been wanting to ask you this for a while, considering, what all that you've done, but people would assume, and I'm just throwing it out there. People will assume Vista was like this overnight sensation. It just happened. And you and I both know that there were a lot of nights and a lot of days relative to creating it. But, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is when did you decide to establish Vista, and how did you prepare for launching it? 'Cause I think that would be something that everyone would find interesting to hear.
Yeah, happy. I mean, when you think about, like the term of the origin story, there's points in time, but there's, often, pathways that lead to that point in time. And if I really wind it back, there's a whole bunch of, elements in that led to, kind of me saying, hey, this makes sense to do. This makes sense to take a risk, to start a business, to leave a place like Goldman Sachs, to go start a business in an area that no one else is doing at a time when everybody thought it was crazy. So let's wind it back, because it is important to really think about the preparation. And it wasn't like, oh man, all roads lead to this. It was all roads were frankly, designed around things that I was interested in. I had the opportunity to get an internship. I've told that story, so I won't tell it much more, at Bell Labs when I was 17 years old. And that exposed me to the world of technology. And I started to understand the power of the future. Prior to that, we lived in, me personally, a completely analog world. You and I are, digital immigrants. A lot of, hopefully the kids or people or young people on this Zoom are digital natives. And so they are experiencing and have experienced the world very different than what you and I dealt with. I crack up every now and then with some of my kids, and I show them
you too, huh?
A telephone, right? Remember the old telephones? They kind of look at that thing, right? Say, Dad, that looks like a save icon. I'm like, well, it's actually a 1.4 megabyte disk, right?
Exactly.
But what happened for me was the exposure to the world of technology through the lens of what was, again, the leader in technology, Bell Laboratories, helped me really understand the impact and power that technology would and could have. We worked on these Merlin PBXs, for instance, give you an example. And if you actually install one of these PBXs in a very large corporation, you could eliminate, 5,000 clerks, for instance, to actually, who were switching calls. Right? You start thinking about that. You start thinking about the economic benefit of that. Well, ultimately, I decided to go into chemical engineering, and at the time, we of course focused on what we call unit operations, transformation of one form of matter to another, taking sand and making silicon wafers, or taking oil and making plastic. But it was at a dawning of an age where we were starting to implement technology and computing power into the control systems of those unit operations. And the efficiency from that was just exponential. I remember one of the plants I was tasked to modernize and put in a programmable logic controller. When I was done with that work, increase the productivity by like 26%, which is a whole shift. If you think about it, increase the plant productivity by one whole shift, basically by putting tighter controls in. And then, it was at the time where they were starting to implement spreadsheets. And you remember there was VisiCalc and Multiplan and Lotus 123, and now we've all converged on Excel, and this all kind of leads to an interesting story. But ultimately, what that started to show me was the implications and impact that technology would have, not only in the plant environment, but in the office environment. So, as I'm now at Goldman Sachs and I'm working on, my clients include a little company called Apple Computer at the time, a little company called Microsoft, a little company called eBay, a little company called Yahoo. Hewlett Packard, Texas Instruments. I'm sure you've heard of a couple of those names.
Yep. Yep.
And it was then a dawning when some of those companies were struggling to survive. Some were trying to understand business models. And I started to realize that in the world of enterprise or business software, that it was really at the beginning, call it the beginning of the first inning of that. People were now starting to buy computing power en masse. They were able to get financing for computing power. That was all new, believe it or not. I'm going to finance a new computer. It's like $1 million, and get an IBM, 370, and then you got to get, some refrigerated space. Some people put it in a closet or whatever, and then connect some terminals and some printers and all that sort of stuff. And well, what that led to for me was, frankly, the realization that the efficiency of this product that would ultimately be sold, which is software, and I'll get to that in a second, was going to far outstrip, in terms of the demand, the cost of implementing that software. So, ultimately, what you started to see, what you see today, is a commoditization of the hardware and all the values in the software. But no one was focused on doing buyouts in enterprise software. And as you met, and as I had a chance to meet, literally hundreds of software executives from some of the biggest companies, which I named, to some of the smallest, what I realized was that none of them actually did things the same. Now, being a process engineer, the most efficient thing you can do is kind of do the same thing over and over, repeatable processes, as opposed to each time you try to reinvent the wheel and refigure it out. And I said, well, if you brought a set of standardized conditions to the running of software companies, you probably get a pretty standardized output that probably you could control. And so that's, if you think about it, those are the insights and the dynamics that led to that. Now, the real challenge, of course, is the risk of leaving a great job like Goldman Sachs. And my grandfather thought I'd lost my mind. He was from Washington, D.C. And he's like, how could you ever leave Goldman Sachs? And I had long conversations with my grandfather about this. And finally, he kind of came around and said, yeah, this makes sense. But what he realized that I saw was the importance of being an independent businessman. Okay. And as an African-American, having an opportunity to do something that no other African-American heretofore had done. Right. And he said, and if you don't do that, how are you really going to feel about yourself? Right. And you got to take, and if you're going to take a risk, take that risk on yourself. Look, there's a whole lot of risks in this business. I deal with risk every single day. Some of them I get completely right. Some of them I get wrong. Right. But that is something you have to tune yourself to, in understanding that is the nature of what capitalism is how you think about risk. And I would just encourage, many of the executives on these calls to really stand back and think about risk and think about, the advantages of taking on more risk and setting up and, starting your own businesses. I was very encouraged to see an opening video about the restaurant in Memphis, Tennessee. And I remember, like I said, growing up in this beloved community, man, we went to all Black restaurants and Black grocery store and all those sort of things. And, the dry cleaners. And frankly, once desegregation occurred, almost all those businesses went out of business. Right. And now here's a chance for us to kind of reinvent and rebuild that fabric in our community.